So, Donald Trump just watched the Supreme Court put his entire tariff strategy on trial. And the justices didn't just question his legal arguments. They systematically tore them apart in what legal experts are calling one of the most skeptical Supreme Court hearings against a sitting president's signature policy in modern history. And what makes this absolutely devastating? We're not talking about minor procedural objections or technical legal questions. The Supreme Court justices, including Trump's own appointees, openly challenged whether the president has any constitutional authority to impose what amounts to massive tax increases on American businesses without Congress. According to multiple legal analysts who attended the November 5th oral arguments, the justices' skepticism was so palpable that even Trump's own lawyers left the courtroom looking shell-shocked. This isn't just another legal challenge that Trump can delay and deflect. We're talking about a Supreme Court case that could invalidate tariffs covering nearly 1/3 of all U.S. imports, force the government to refund between $750 billion and $1 trillion to American businesses, and strip Trump of his favorite diplomatic weapon. And trust me, when both conservative and liberal justices are grilling your Solicitor General with questions like what would stop Congress from just handing all its powers to the president, you know the legal foundation of your entire economic agenda is crumbling in real time. It's honestly hard to believe we're watching a situation where Trump's signature policy achievement, the one thing he staked his entire political identity on, could be declared illegal by the very Supreme Court he reshaped with 3 conservative justices. Let me fill you in on what's been happening. This battle over Trump's tariff authority has been grinding through the courts since May 2025, when Trump invoked something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose what he called reciprocal tariffs on virtually every country in the world. Trump declared 2 separate national emergencies, one over the trade deficit with other nations and another over the flow of fentanyl into America, and used those emergency declarations to justify slapping massive tariffs on imports from dozens of countries. We're not talking about targeted trade measures against specific bad actors here. According to the Tax Foundation's analysis, these IEEPA tariffs affect nearly 1/3 of all U.S. imports and increase taxes on American households by an average of $1,000 in 2025 and $1,300 every single year going forward. That's not a foreign policy tool. That's a massive tax increase on American consumers and businesses imposed unilaterally by the president without any vote in Congress. Small businesses and blue state attorneys general immediately sued, arguing that Trump had exceeded his constitutional authority. They pointed out that IEEPA, the emergency law Trump cited, says absolutely nothing about tariffs. The law was designed to let presidents freeze assets and impose sanctions during genuine national security emergencies, like blocking terrorist financing or responding to foreign invasions. It was never intended as a blank check for the president to rewrite America's entire trade policy by declaring perpetual emergencies over economic conditions that have existed for decades. According to Politico's reporting from May 28th, the Court of International Trade unanimously agreed with the challengers, ruling that Trump's use of IEEPA to impose tariffs was illegal and exceeded presidential authority. Trump's team appealed immediately, and the case went to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. That court, with 11 judges hearing the case, split 7-4 against Trump. Think about that for a second. 7 federal judges, including multiple judges appointed by Republican presidents, looked at Trump's legal arguments and said, no, the president doesn't have this power. But here's where the rubber meets the road. The case reached the Supreme Court in September 2025, and both sides asked the court to expedite consideration because the tariffs are costing businesses billions of dollars while the legal battle drags on. The Supreme Court agreed, scheduling oral arguments for November 5th, 2025, an extraordinarily fast timeline for the nation's highest court. And when those arguments happened, Trump's legal position didn't just face skepticism, it got absolutely demolished by justices across the ideological spectrum. According to NPR's coverage of the November 5th hearing, which lasted nearly 3 hours, Trump's Solicitor General, D. John Sauer, faced withering questioning from both conservative and liberal justices. Chief Justice John Roberts immediately zeroed in on the core problem with Trump's argument. He pointed out that the IEEPA statute, as interpreted by Trump, imposes taxes on Americans, and the power to tax has always been the core power of Congress, not the president. That's a devastating observation from the Chief Justice because it frames Trump's tariffs not as foreign policy tools, but as what they actually are: massive tax increases imposed without congressional approval. And before we go any further, let's be real for a second. When the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court is telling your lawyer that your policy looks like an unconstitutional tax increase, you're not dealing with a minor legal technicality. You're dealing with a fundamental separation of powers problem that goes to the heart of how American democracy functions. The Constitution is crystal clear. Congress has the power to regulate commerce and levy taxes. The president enforces laws that Congress passes. When a president starts claiming he can impose hundreds of billions of dollars in new taxes by declaring emergencies that he defines however he wants, we're not talking about creative legal interpretation anymore. We're talking about one branch of government seizing powers that the Constitution explicitly gave to another branch. That's not a conservative or liberal issue. That's a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. Here's where it gets interesting. According to multiple reporters from NPR, CNN, and legal analysts who attended the arguments, Justice Neil Gorsuch, one of Trump's own appointees, delivered perhaps the most devastating critique of the administration's position. Gorsuch, known for his textualist approach to the Constitution, essentially accused the Solicitor General of arguing for unlimited presidential power. When Sauer tried to defend Trump's authority by claiming the president has inherent power over foreign affairs, Gorsuch shot back with a hypothetical that exposed how dangerous that reasoning is. He said, and I'm paraphrasing the exchange here, you're saying inherent authority in foreign affairs applies to everything. Commerce, duties, tariffs, even war, which the Constitution explicitly gives to Congress. You're saying it's inherent authority all the way down. What would stop Congress from just deciding they're tired of legislating and handing everything to the president? That question wasn't rhetorical. Gorsuch was pointing out that if Trump's legal theory is correct, then there's literally no limit on what powers Congress could delegate to the president, effectively eliminating the separation of powers entirely. The bombshell came when Justice Elena Kagan jumped in with perhaps the most cutting observation of the entire hearing. According to NPR's reporting, Kagan responded caustically to the administration's claim that these tariffs were justified by national emergencies. She said, "It turns out we're in emergencies all the time about like half the world." That single sentence destroyed the administration's entire argument, because if the president can declare a national emergency over trade deficits, which have existed for decades, or fentanyl trafficking, which is a serious problem but not a sudden emergency, then literally any economic or social problem can be declared an emergency and used to justify unilateral presidential action. Kagan was pointing out that Trump's legal theory doesn't create emergency powers for genuine crises. It creates permanent dictatorial powers that any president can invoke whenever they want by simply calling something an emergency. This testimony sent shockwaves through the legal community and the business world because it became clear that Trump wasn't just facing skepticism from liberal justices. His own appointees, the conservative justices he's counted on to support him in every other legal battle, were openly questioning whether his tariff policy violated fundamental constitutional principles. According to CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin, who's covered Supreme Court arguments for decades, the level of skepticism from Trump's appointees was extraordinary and suggested the court is likely to rule against the administration. Even Justice Amy Coney Barrett, Trump's most recent appointee, posed a question that revealed she's worried about the practical consequences of invalidating these tariffs. She asked Trump's lawyer how refunds would work if the government had to return all the money that businesses have already paid. When the lawyer tried to explain there would be various options, Barrett cut him off and said, "So a mess." That comment is significant because it shows that even justices who might be sympathetic to Trump's policy goals recognize that his administration created a legal and financial disaster. Now, this isn't the first time we've seen Trump try to push the boundaries of presidential authority and then act shocked when courts push back. His entire presidency, first term and second term, has been defined by a pattern of claiming powers that presidents have never had and fighting legal battles when courts tell him no. Just think about how Trump tried to build his border wall by declaring a national emergency and diverting military construction funds. Congress explicitly refused to appropriate the money Trump wanted for the wall. So Trump declared an emergency and tried to take the money anyway. Federal courts blocked major portions of that plan, ruling that Trump couldn't use emergency declarations to bypass Congress's power of the purse. Trump claimed it was activism from liberal judges, but the rulings were based on straightforward constitutional principles. Congress controls spending, and presidents can't just declare emergencies to get around that. Then there was Trump's attempt to ban TikTok and WeChat through executive order during his first term. Trump claimed that national security concerns gave him authority to ban apps used by millions of Americans without any congressional authorization or due process. Multiple federal courts blocked those orders, finding that Trump exceeded his authority and violated the First Amendment. The pattern was identical. Trump claimed sweeping emergency powers. Courts said those powers don't exist. And Trump attacked the courts as political rather than acknowledging he overstepped. And let's not forget Trump's use of emergency declarations to fast-track environmental reviews for energy projects. Trump argued that the president could declare an emergency and waive environmental laws that Congress passed. Again, courts said no, explaining that emergency powers don't give the president authority to override laws that Congress enacted. Throughout Trump's time in office, he's consistently claimed that presidential authority in areas like foreign affairs, national security, and emergencies is essentially unlimited. And courts have consistently told him he's wrong. The pattern is absolutely clear. Trump views legal limits on presidential power as suggestions that don't apply to him. He declares emergencies not because genuine crises require immediate action, but because emergency declarations give him legal cover to do things Congress won't authorize. Then, when courts strike down his actions, he claims the judiciary is biased against him rather than accepting that the Constitution limits what presidents can do. Now, with the tariff case, we're seeing this pattern play out on the biggest stage possible. Trump declared emergencies over trade deficits and fentanyl, neither of which are sudden crises requiring emergency action. He used those declarations to impose massive tax increases without congressional approval. Lower courts said that's illegal. And now the Supreme Court, including justices Trump appointed, appears poised to agree with those lower courts. So, what specifically did the Supreme Court justices say during oral arguments that makes legal experts so certain Trump is going to lose this case? Let's break it down because the details matter enormously. According to legal analysts who reviewed the transcript and attended the arguments, the justices' questions revealed three major problems with Trump's legal position that the administration simply couldn't answer. First, there's the constitutional problem with calling tariffs anything other than what they are: taxes. Chief Justice Roberts made this point explicitly. The IEEPA statute says nothing about tariffs or taxes. It talks about blocking transactions and freezing assets during emergencies. Trump's lawyers argued that the phrase regulate importation in the statute includes the power to impose tariffs. But as Roberts pointed out, that interpretation means the president is imposing taxes on Americans, and taxation is Congress's core constitutional power. Roberts essentially asked Trump's lawyer to explain how the president can impose what amounts to hundreds of billions of dollars in new taxes without violating the Constitution's separation of powers. The lawyer had no good answer because there is no good answer. Either tariffs or taxes, and Trump needs congressional authorization, or they're not taxes, and then Trump's entire justification for why these tariffs are necessary falls apart. Now, here's the kicker. The second major problem is the unlimited scope of power Trump is claiming. Justice Gorsuch hammered this point repeatedly. If Trump can declare a national emergency over trade deficits and then impose any level of tariffs he wants for any duration he wants, what's the limiting principle? What couldn't a president do by declaring an emergency? Gorsuch pointed out that Trump's legal theory would allow a future president to declare a climate emergency and impose massive tariffs on all imports from countries that don't meet certain environmental standards. Under Trump's logic, that would be perfectly legal because the president has inherent authority over foreign affairs. Or a president could declare an emergency over income inequality and impose tariffs to redistribute wealth. Or over public health and impose tariffs to fund healthcare programs. Trump's lawyers tried to argue that there are limits, but they couldn't articulate what those limits actually are, because their theory is that the president's emergency powers are essentially unlimited as long as the president can connect the declared emergency to foreign affairs or national security. That's not a legal framework. That's a recipe for dictatorship. The third major problem, and this one clearly troubled several justices, is the practical impossibility of unwinding these tariffs if the court rules they're illegal. Justice Barrett kept returning to this issue. According to reporting from NPR and CNN, businesses have already paid over $200 billion in these IEEPA tariffs. The Trump administration itself estimated that if the court invalidates the tariffs, the government might have to refund between $750 billion and $1 trillion when you factor in all the tariffs that would have been collected by the time the court issues its ruling, which won't come until June 2026 at the earliest. That's an absolutely staggering amount of money to have to refund to businesses all at once. The logistics alone would be a nightmare. Customs forms would need to be reviewed. Refund claims would need to be processed, and businesses would need to track down documentation for tariff payments they made months or years ago. Barrett's comment that it would be a mess was an understatement. This would be one of the largest financial unwinds in American history. According to legal scholars who spoke to SCOTUS blog, the court has a few options for how to handle the refund problem if they rule against Trump. They could order prospective relief only, meaning the tariffs would be invalidated going forward, but businesses wouldn't get refunds for tariffs already paid. This would limit the financial chaos, but would be deeply unfair to businesses who were forced to pay illegal taxes. Or they could order full refunds, but give the government time to set up a streamlined process, similar to what happened when the court struck down other taxes in the past. Or they could order immediate refunds and let the administrative chaos be the government's problem to solve. None of these options are great, and the justices clearly understand that whatever remedy they impose will have massive economic consequences. This leaves Trump's legal team in an extraordinarily difficult position. On one side, they need to defend a legal theory that even conservative justices find troubling because it essentially claims unlimited presidential power. They have to argue that the president can impose massive taxes without congressional approval, that emergency declarations can be based on long-standing economic conditions rather than genuine crises, and that there are no meaningful limits on what a president can do by declaring an emergency. That's not a legal argument most judges, even conservative ones, are going to accept because it contradicts basic constitutional principles that conservatives claim to care about. On the flip side, if Trump's team admits there should be limits on presidential emergency powers, then they have to explain why Trump's tariffs don't exceed those limits. And they can't do that without admitting that trade deficits and fentanyl trafficking, while serious issues, are not the kind of sudden emergencies that justify unilateral presidential action. The tricky part is there's genuinely no way out of this box. Trump's legal theory is either unlimited, which justices won't accept, or it has limits, in which case Trump exceeded those limits. Those are the only two options, and both lead to Trump losing this case. This whole scenario is causing absolute panic throughout the business community and Trump's economic team. According to reporting from multiple outlets, including the Washington Times and CNN, the administration is already preparing contingency plans for what to do if the Supreme Court invalidates the IEEPA tariffs. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick told CNBC that the administration has other tools to impose tariffs if they lose at the Supreme Court. What he's referring to are alternative tariff authorities that Trump has already been using, like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which allows tariffs for national security reasons, and Section 301 of the Trade Act, which allows tariffs in response to unfair trade practices. The problem is that those alternative authorities have much stricter procedures and limitations than IEEPA. Section 232 requires formal investigations by the Commerce Department and findings that specific imports threaten national security. Section 301 requires the U.S. Trade Representative to investigate foreign trade practices and make specific findings of unfairness. Both processes take months, require public comment periods, and are subject to judicial review. Trump can't just wake up one morning and impose new tariffs like he's been doing under IEEPA. That's exactly why Trump likes IEEPA so much. It's fast, it's broad, and up until now, no president has tried to use it for tariffs, so there wasn't much case law limiting it. Meanwhile, Trump himself has been melting down on Truth Social and in public statements about the Supreme Court case. According to multiple reports, Trump posted that a negative decision by the Supreme Court would be the biggest threat in history to United States national security and would leave the country financially defenseless. He accused justices who questioned his authority of harboring dark side and sinister forces that want to see American strength end. That kind of rhetoric is extraordinary because Trump is essentially threatening the Supreme Court, including his own appointees, and trying to intimidate them into ruling in his favor. Legal experts told the Hill that Trump's public attacks on the court could actually backfire by reinforcing the perception that Trump believes he's above the law and doesn't respect judicial independence. When you're trying to convince judges that you have respect for constitutional limits on power, it doesn't help to simultaneously claim that any judge who rules against you is part of a sinister conspiracy. According to sources who spoke to CNN and Politico, Trump's advisors are divided about how to respond if the court rules against him. One faction wants Trump to immediately impose similar tariffs using Section 232 and Section 301, sending the message that Trump's tariff policy isn't going anywhere, even if the court strikes down his method of imposing them. The problem with that approach is it would take months to impose tariffs through those alternative authorities, and in the meantime, the tariffs would come off and businesses would get refunds. Another faction thinks Trump should position a negative ruling as proof that the Supreme Court has been captured by globalist interests and use it as a rallying cry for his base. But that approach risks making Trump look weak and powerless if his signature policy gets struck down and he can't quickly reimpose similar tariffs. A third group of advisors is quietly suggesting that maybe Trump should work with Congress to get statutory authorization for the tariffs he wants. But Trump has shown zero interest in that approach because it would require negotiating with Democrats in the Senate and making concessions.
So let's break down what this could mean, because it's not just a captivating legal case. It has serious consequences for Trump's economic agenda, American businesses, constitutional law, and the separation of powers. First up is the immediate economic impact. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, businesses would be entitled to refunds for all the tariffs they've paid under IEEPA. According to estimates from Goldman Sachs economists, we're talking about potentially $750 billion to $1 trillion in refunds. That's an enormous amount of money flowing back to businesses all at once. For many companies, especially small and mid-sized importers, those refunds would be a massive cash infusion that could fund expansion, hiring, or paying down debt. But for the federal government, it would blow a hole in the budget because tariff revenue has become a significant source of income under Trump's policies. The administration would have to figure out how to process potentially millions of refund claims while also dealing with a sudden revenue shortfall. The logistics and economic disruption would be unprecedented. Beyond the immediate refund chaos, there's the question of what happens to Trump's tariff policy going forward. According to analysis from Goldman Sachs and other economic forecasters, Trump would likely try to reimpose similar tariffs using Section 232 and Section 301 authorities. But those processes are much slower and more constrained. Section 232 investigations typically take months and require genuine findings that imports threaten national security. Trump has already used Section 232 for steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, furniture, cars, and car parts. He's ordered investigations into semiconductors, medical supplies, and robotics. But expanding Section 232 to cover everything that's currently under IEEPA tariffs would be difficult because many of those products simply don't have plausible national security justifications. Section 301 has similar limitations. It requires the U.S. Trade Representative to investigate specific unfair trade practices and make findings before imposing tariffs. You can't just declare that every country in the world is engaging in unfair trade and slap tariffs on all of them. Well, you can try, but those tariffs would get challenged in court and likely struck down too. Looking ahead to the political implications, this creates a massive problem for Trump's 2026 re-election campaign. Trump has staked his entire economic identity on tariffs. He constantly talks about how tariffs are making America wealthy, how other countries are paying these tariffs they're not. American importers are, and how his tariff policy is the greatest economic achievement in American history. If the Supreme Court, including 3 justices he appointed, rules that his tariffs are illegal and unconstitutional, that's a devastating blow to Trump's credibility. He can't claim he's a master deal maker and brilliant businessman when the Supreme Court thinks his signature policy violates the Constitution. Democrats and any Republican primary challengers would absolutely hammer Trump on this. The ads write themselves. Video of Trump bragging about his tariffs, followed by the Supreme Court ruling they're illegal, followed by businesses getting refunds because Trump exceeded his authority. That's a brutal campaign narrative for Trump to overcome, especially when inflation and cost of living are top voter concerns. Now, let's touch on what this means for constitutional law and separation of powers. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, it would be a landmark decision reaffirming that Congress's power to tax and regulate commerce can't be delegated away through vague emergency statutes. According to constitutional law professors who spoke to various news outlets, such a ruling would stand as a major check on executive overreach. It would make it much harder for future presidents to claim sweeping powers by declaring emergencies. That would be a huge victory for anyone who cares about constitutional limits on power, regardless of party. On the other hand, if the Supreme Court somehow upholds Trump's tariffs, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power in American government. It would mean that any president can declare an emergency over virtually anything and use that declaration to impose major policy changes that Congress never authorized. That's not how the Constitution is supposed to work, and it would open the door to massive abuses of power by future presidents from both parties. The institutional implications are equally significant. This case is a test of whether the Supreme Court, despite being dominated by conservative justices, including 3 Trump appointees, will stand up to executive overreach when it comes from a Republican president. Based on the oral arguments, it appears that at least some conservative justices are willing to rule against Trump when he clearly exceeds constitutional limits. That would be a crucial demonstration of judicial independence and would show that conservative judges care about constitutional principles more than partisan loyalty.
But if the court upholds Trump's tariffs despite the serious constitutional problems they raise, it would damage the court's credibility and fuel perceptions that the conservative majority is just a rubber stamp for Republican policies. According to legal scholars who spoke to various outlets, another major implication involves future uses of emergency powers. IEEPA and similar emergency statutes have been around for decades, but presidents generally use them sparingly for genuine crises like terrorist attacks, foreign invasions, or humanitarian disasters. Trump has normalized using emergency declarations as a routine way to bypass Congress on policy issues. If the Supreme Court doesn't push back on this, future presidents will follow Trump's playbook and emergency powers will become the new normal way to make policy without congressional approval. That would fundamentally break our system of checks and balances. Congress would become increasingly irrelevant because any time they refuse to pass legislation the president wants, the president can just declare an emergency and act unilaterally. That's not democracy. That's sliding toward authoritarianism. This whole scenario represents a defining moment for American constitutional democracy. According to analysis from the Peterson Institute for International Economics and other policy experts, the Supreme Court's decision in this case will either reaffirm that no president is above the law and constitutional limits matter, or it will greenlight unlimited executive power as long as presidents invoke magic words like emergency and national security. Those are the stakes here. It's not just about tariffs or trade policy. It's about whether we still have a functioning separation of powers or whether we've evolved into a system where presidents can do whatever they want by declaring emergencies. Meanwhile, businesses across America are in limbo waiting for the Supreme Court's decision. According to reporting from Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal, companies are trying to plan for multiple scenarios. Some are holding off on major investments until they know whether tariffs will stay or go. Others are trying to position themselves to receive refunds if the court rules against Trump by making sure all their customs documentation is in order. Many businesses are hedging by pursuing tariff exclusions and other strategies to minimize their exposure regardless of how the court rules. The uncertainty alone is costly because businesses can't make long-term decisions when fundamental questions about the tariff environment remain unresolved. So, here's the deal. Donald Trump's signature economic policy, the tariffs he's imposed on nearly one-third of all U.S. imports by declaring national emergencies, just faced brutal skepticism from Supreme Court justices, including his own appointees. The justices, both conservative and liberal, openly questioned whether Trump has any constitutional authority to impose these massive tax increases without Congress. Legal experts who attended the oral arguments are predicting Trump will lose this case, which would force the government to refund potentially $1 trillion to businesses and strip Trump of his favorite policy tool. This isn't just about trade policy or tariffs. It's about whether the Constitution still means anything when it limits what presidents can do. Trump's legal theory is that presidents have essentially unlimited power in foreign affairs and can declare emergencies over anything to bypass Congress. That theory contradicts basic separation of powers principles that conservatives claim to care about, which is why even Trump's own appointees are skeptical. If Trump loses this case, we're about to see one of the largest financial unwinds in American history as the government refunds hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs that the Supreme Court says were illegally imposed. We'll see Trump scrambling to reimpose similar tariffs using slower, more limited authorities that require congressional input and judicial review. And we'll see a major ruling reaffirming that presidents can't just declare emergencies whenever they want to do things Congress won't authorize. If the court somehow upholds Trump's tariffs despite the serious constitutional problems they raise, we're about to enter a new era where presidential power is essentially unlimited as long as presidents invoke the magic words emergency and national security. That would fundamentally break our constitutional system and turn the presidency into an elective dictatorship. Either way, the Supreme Court's decision, which will come sometime before June 2026, will define the boundaries of presidential power for generations to come. The stakes have never been higher, the economic consequences never more massive, and the constitutional principles at issue never more fundamental to whether we remain a nation of laws or become a nation ruled by whoever occupies the White House. The oral arguments made clear that Trump's legal position is on extremely shaky ground. The justices aren't buying his arguments. His own appointees are skeptical, and legal experts across the political spectrum are predicting he's going to lose. The question now is how the court will structure its ruling, what remedy it will impose, and whether Trump will respect the court's authority or continue claiming that anyone who rules against him is part of a sinister conspiracy. Keep watching this case. The decision will be one of the most important Supreme Court rulings in decades, with implications that go far beyond tariffs to the very structure of American constitutional democracy.